Good morning, thank you for joining us today for Webinar Wednesday for September 2018. This morning's session, we're looking at Back to Basics, Protecting the Building User. My name is Katie, I'm Head of IT and Digital here at CABE and I'll be acting as your moderator for this morning's session. If you want to get in touch with us, we do like to hear from you throughout the presentation this morning. So if you want to send us any questions, somewhere on your screen, perhaps on the right-hand side or at the top, you will have a question panel that you can just type in questions and they'll pop up on my screen and then I can pick those up and we'll either look at those as we go or perhaps pick those up at the end. We do publish our webinars to YouTube afterwards, so if you are watching this webinar in effect on our channel via catch-up, then you can still send any questions over to us and I will put those to our presenter and we'll get back to you sort of separately. Hashtag on Twitter, CABECPD, you can also get in touch with us that way. Your presenter this morning is Kevin Blunden, and Kevin is the Director and General Manager at ADIS Regulatory Services, which is a leading approved inspector. But you may be familiar with Kevin because prior to taking up that position nearly a year ago now, he actually worked here at CABE as our technical representative for 9 years. And in that time, he worked with the industry to raise standards and develop the association's competency framework for membership. So he's a chartered building engineer, chartered environmentalist, and a registered European building expert and a fellow of the Chartered Management Institute. He's also chairman of the East Midlands region of CABE, and he was elected to the board in May of this year. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to Kevin. So if you just give me a couple of seconds to do that, and then he will take you through this morning's presentation.
Good morning. Welcome to the webinar. Hopefully all the technology is working. I've clicked all the right buttons and it seems to be. So this morning, yes, I'm going to talk to you about the need to perhaps refocus where the industry is, some of the debate that's going on at the moment, some of the challenges and the issues that are facing us, in looking forward to try and make sure that at the heart of the construction process is the need to protect the ultimate user of the building. Katie's done a fairly marvelous introduction. That's right, for some reason now. There we go, my slides weren't moving. So I don't really need to run over who I am or where I'm from. So I'm going to start right from the beginning. If we start to look at refocusing where we are in terms of the industry, what we're actually trying to achieve, perhaps it's worth just for a few minutes considering why we put buildings together in the first place. And I think this is where, to be honest, over a period of time, the needs of the end user and the aspects that we consider when we put together a building have sort of grown considerably. Originally, buildings were basically there to protect us from the environment and to protect us from other people and other creatures on this planet. And we evolved then to look at something to give us a bit more warmth, something to give us a bit of privacy, a bit of security. But ultimately, that's where the focus started. And then obviously, as we've moved on, things have got more convoluted to the point where if we look at the regulatory framework now, we're even looking at things like connectivity and broadband speed. And I suppose what I'm hoping today is to provoke a bit of thought, throw some questions out there, and see what people think. And I think the first question we have to think about is if we are refocusing and looking at the protection of the building user, are we actually spreading ourselves too thin with such a wide remit of regulation and aspects that we're attempting to control, that actually the net result is that rather than doing a few things really, really well, we're doing a lot of things in a mediocre sort of a way. And perhaps there needs to be an element of refocusing what we're looking at and trying to get back to the basics of making sure the building stands up, protects us, clearly won't fall down, won't burn down, but almost going back to the days of King Hammurabi. Now, those of you who knew me from my CABE days will not have been able to go through a presentation about legislation and standards without mentioning King Hammurabi of the Babylonian Empire. Now, to be fair, he didn't simply set the first building regulation. he actually set about 200 regulations. Most of them had the same output as the first building reg, which really said if you build a building and it falls down and kills somebody, then you should be put to death. And that sort of approach applied to all the regulations he had. But interestingly, there was a sort of a framework to it. If you were part of the higher echelons in society, perhaps didn't get put totally to death, you were just flogged or something of that sort. But really, a lot of our regulations and control since then has been a backward step, because the legislation is perceived today as being somewhat toothless. And actually, the penalties for getting things wrong aren't quite as severe as perhaps they should be. People don't necessarily appreciate it, and it's only in the last 18 months, 2 years, that the ramifications of what we're doing have really started to hit home, and with the possibility of criminal prosecutions and civil actions, people are starting to look at what it is we're actually trying to do in this industry and how liable we are for what we actually put together. So I'm sure you will have seen in your element of the industry, I've certainly seen it in the aspects I deal with, that the knee-jerk reaction at the moment is a sort of a regroup and seek comfort in the things we know work and we know can be trusted. And to a certain extent, there's a stifling of innovation and innovative solutions and alternative proposals to achieve a solution that meets the required minimum standards. So we've gone back, as the slide sort of says, to a belt and braces approach and make sure that things don't go wrong. And to a certain extent, that's an approach we've had for a long time in this country. The reason we don't see a high number of structural failures of buildings is because of the factors of safety that we build into the calculation methodology. And with a lot of what we do, we're achieving a safe and secure environment which actually exceeds what would be a minimum if we were back in standards some while ago. But there is an element at the moment that in providing this belt and braces type approach, what we're actually ending up with is a straitjacket that's very rigid in what we will and won't allow, and that's based on guidance that the industry has acknowledged at the moment isn't really fit for purpose and is under review. And certainly at the moment, to stick your head above the parapet and come up with a slightly different design is very difficult to do, very difficult to get your PI insurers to support, and very difficult to persuade people to accept as a suitable solution. So we've seen this sort of contraction at the moment back to what does it say and what can we be sure we actually look at. And alongside this, we've got a more or less weekly update of revisions to standards, attention to detail, focusing what we're looking at to make sure that we're actually looking at the information that's relevant. And I think one of the key elements with that, and that's become totally apparent, is the industry has got very used to relying on certification, whether it's lifetime certification or test certificates in relation to products. And we expect to see that bit of paper. But I think from the point of view of clients, designers, regulators, we need to be delving more into what the bits of paper actually say, because people are being provided with certificates, and it's not until you go into the nth degree of the detail that you can be sure it actually achieves what you're trying to achieve. So what are we going to do about it? Well, from my perspective at ADIS, I'm requesting in the future that all company vehicles become DeLoreans and can do 88 miles per hour, because we do seem to be in a situation at the moment that the only way to be sure that you've got it right is to look at the project in hindsight and establish that everything was okay. It is much, much easier to stand back and say, yes, looking at it now, we can see why it went wrong. And it's not necessarily easy at the time to understand what could go wrong from all of the different aspects. And I think there is an element here of responsibility as well when we're putting the building together. And a responsibility linked with a competence to do what you're doing and an understanding of the implication of what's being done. Because quite often it's the interaction of elements of putting things together and putting it together properly that actually then creates a situation of knowing that we know we've got it right. You may well have seen guidance that's come out of the government recently on the testing of fire doors. suggesting that we need to tighten up and make sure we've got the right test results. And it says quite clearly in the guidance that's come out that obviously fire doors should be tested from both sides. Now, as an industry, we've got used to the idea that what we've traditionally been trying to protect is a fire breaking out of a room into a corridor. And, you know, I can remember when I started in the industry way too many years ago, that if you were looking to upgrade existing doors to become fire doors, you lined them on the room side to protect from that element. Testing fire doors from both sides is critical if the door is different from both sides. So for something like a flat entrance door that has a different appearance, different face, different finish, perfectly logical. A door that's more or less symmetrical, my worry is if we start getting hung up on which side was the door tested from, then we get into all sorts of problems about which way is it being hung, and if we hung it on the right side, and is it opening the right way? And there has to be, alongside this re-examination of the standards we're looking for, a good degree of common sense that goes with everything. One of the problems we have in trying to look at the industry and how we can move forward is the skill base that we have within the sector. Whether it's construction on site, designing buildings, regulating them, or looking after the buildings in use later on, there is a shortage of people with the right skills and level of competence to move it forward. And particularly as we try and bring forward new methods of construction, off-site and the like, we have to make sure that we've got the right people in the right place with the right skills. Now, the construction industry breaks down into the research and innovation, which comes up with the products and the way for the future, putting that into development and production, and then using and applying that on site. And all the way through the process, we need to have the right people with the right skills. But one of the problems is that there is a disconnect. We have a theoretical approach to research that actually most of what we end up with is predominantly research with a little bit of testing alongside it, because testing, let's face it, is expensive and it's very difficult to bring new products to market. But there's a bit of a disconnect between that academic and scientific element and when we actually get to put these things onto site. And all the way through the process, there's a need for people to be trained and skilled appropriately. And I'm the first to promote the fact that this training, this upskilling, this need for competence demonstration is not something you do at the end of your degree when you gain a professional membership. It's not something you do whilst you're training. It's something you have to continue to do all the way through your career. For instance, in our company, we've just introduced a system where every technical member of staff will undergo a re-examination every couple of years to prove to us that they are competent, and so that we can effectively ensure that we give them the work to look at that they are capable of dealing with. And this sort of license to practice arrangement is going to fall out throughout the whole sector, to make sure that when a client appoints a designer and they then look at contractors, and then they look at maybe a building control body, and later on they look at somebody to manage the facilities and do the maintenance, that all of those people have the right correct skills and knowledge to do so all the way through the process. So a lot of it is about where we are, and if we're trying to build up a skills base, part of the problem we have is with the qualification and training regime. It is still quite fragmented, and I find it incredibly frustrating that qualifications change in what they describe themselves as on a fairly regular basis. We'll have all seen in the past couple of weeks the results of people doing their GCSEs, and we're now talking about evaluating those on a scale from 1 to 9. Prior to that, obviously, we had the grading system. I'm really old school and showing my age. I come from the time when there were O levels, so that's a different standard again. But even in things that are slightly, if you like, newfangled qualifications, in my way of thinking things, NVQs, which have probably been with us for 20 years now, the framework changes and levels change. What used to be a level 4 NVQ is suddenly a level 6, and it's very, very difficult for people to understand with these changing definitions what qualifications somebody coming to them has actually got. And then the other thing is that a lot of the educational provision in the UK is quite limited in terms of where it can be accessed, and quite fragmented in terms of its approach to actually delivering. And that's across design, construction, building control, and everything else. The other issue is that the academic world, with the best will in the world, they are there to educate and develop people, but their key priority is about getting numbers through the door. And if there aren't enough people coming forward, they will adjust their academic programs to be more enticing to bring the right people forward, which might mean that they drop some of the key aspects that are needed for some of the smaller parts of the market, some of the key specialists that we need. So there's a little bit of a disconnect. There's also a fairly short-term view within industry. When I started too many years ago, my employer took the view that they would train people, because if those people didn't stay with them as a company, they would move on to somebody else. And it was a sort of a swings and roundabouts type approach. You gained and you lost, but the industry was generally training. Now, people are very much more reluctant to train because they want the immediacy of having somebody in who can do the job from day one. And they don't want to put in the effort and the expense if somebody's likely to leave at some stage in the future. We also have a lack of apprenticeships and funding for people at the professional sort of level or going into the professions. So it does make it quite difficult. Alongside that, each of the professions tends to have slightly different requirements of academic qualifications and accredit things in slightly different ways. So we end up with a huge mismatch of qualifications that actually the students going forward and enrolling on those don't necessarily understand exactly what they're going to be capable of doing when they drop off the back of the qualification. So I've talked about competence quite a lot, and it's not going to go away. It is a blend of knowledge, experience, and skills, but the key is, as I said just now, it's not just at one point in your career, it's all the way through your career. And how do we actually demonstrate the standard, and who actually sets the standard we're trying to demonstrate? Some years ago, whilst I was with CABE, I sat on some panels that were being facilitated for construction skills and asset skills to set national occupational standards for professions like planning, building control, conservation. And there are nationally written standards of what people are expected to know, but they don't actually filter down to the industry as a benchmark to assess people against. So what we're going to need as an industry is a joined up sort of approach, and the best way to make sure that we get buildings that protect the end user and function properly is to have good communication all the way through the process. I'm an absolutely firm believer that part of the issue we have with the way buildings have been put together and some of the issues we're starting to see now is that we don't finish designing the building until it's pretty much complete, and things change as we go along on site. If we had a system where the design was agreed and set before we started on site and people stuck to that agreed design, it would be much easier to make sure that we had good compliant buildings. But adjusting the design, substitution of materials, cutting corners is the way the industry tends to go. One of the phrases I absolutely hate at the moment in the sector is value engineering. Value engineering at its heart, yes, making sure we're getting value for money, we're achieving what the client needs and not wasting resources is absolutely fine. But when people come to me and say, can you help me value engineer this project? What they mean is, what can we cut out to get this project to a bare minimum level of compliance? And what is the minimum we have to do? And the building regulations and the standards we set are minimum standards, yet everybody seems to aim for that minimum acceptable standard. And as a result, we quite often don't achieve it. So as an industry, we do need to refocus. We need to be striving for excellence and raising the bar in terms of what is best practice. At the moment, we go for minimum standards. Now, we have much more savvy clients than we had 20, 30, 40 years ago. 40 years ago, if somebody took a new house on and it had some movement, cracking, and some odd little problems, the client tended to accept it. Nowadays, all clients are designers via Google. So as soon as they move in, not only do they want absolute perfection, but they will go away and come to a conclusion about what perfection actually is. So we do see a client which in some respects are more savvy, and that's not a bad thing, but also that are looking for a much higher standard of delivery. And quite often they want something that's a much more complete and finished product than can be given to them if we stick to this minimum acceptable value. And the minimum acceptable does tend to be, unfortunately, the default design. It also means that if you aim for a target, which happens to be the minimum, if anything in the process fails, you don't hit that target. So we end up with buildings that possibly don't comply. And whilst we tend to see a lot of highlight complaints and issues about failure, when it comes to things like structural failure or fire precautions or things of that nature, a lot of the elements of the building that we actually put together that cause a failure don't actually become apparent. So if something has failed in the construction so that the thermal performance of the building isn't as good as we would expect it to be, or the sound insulation isn't quite as good, or the ventilation is poorer than we would want, quite often the client won't pick up on that. It's still a failure, it's still potentially affecting their health and safety in their environment, but it doesn't get spotted as easily as damp penetrating a wall. So quite often some of the shortfalls don't get picked up on it. As I've said, we end up with this value engineering down to the minimum standard. And then there is this lack of understanding of the person actually installing the element, actually doing the work into what is going to cause failure and what the implication of what they're doing is. And that is only going to be resolved by training and communication. So you'll have seen the reports that have been generated in the past few months. And there is a whole issue about where does the responsibility lie. And you can more or less follow the arrows on this diagram round forevermore. Everybody has a degree of responsibility within the construction process. The owner and the client clearly has a responsibility in terms of who they appoint. And in the legislative framework in building regulations, carry the ultimate can if something's wrong. But I think where it gets more convoluted is where does the responsibility lie between the designer, the person carrying out the work, building control, and a warranty provider. And at the moment, there is a huge responsibility on the person carrying out the work, but I think it needs to be much more defined as to who is responsible where. And I do believe that if building control are there to certify a building as compliant, then they should bear a portion of the responsibility if it isn't. I would caveat that by saying that actually, in order for building control to be able to do a full and thorough job, they need to be paid appropriately to do that function. And at the moment, a lot of the fees set by building control bodies are less than adequate to do a correct job on a project. But there needs to be a whole sort of an approach working through. And particularly when we're looking at new construction, an interlink between the people who are certifying and the people who are looking after the future of the building and providing a warranty perhaps needs to be there. In my particular company, ADIS, we have a building control arm, we have a warranty provider, and we work fairly closely together on jobs where we're providing both so that we can ensure that the end product is fit for use by the client. But I said within that diagram that the client has a responsibility, and they do, and they're very good at Googling after the event about what's gone wrong, not so good about the research in the beginning to make sure they're appointing the right people in the first place. The number of times that you get a poor quality job, the client's complaining, and actually the problem comes down to the fact that they've accepted the cheapest possible quote in the expectation that it was still going to get the best possible product. They do need to do their homework more. They do need to look at who they're appointing. They do need to get references and get the right advice from the right qualified professionals. And again, they need to understand what the role of those professionals are in the process. And I think it's an obligation on all of us that when the client comes to us, we seek to ensure that they're getting the right advice and moving it forward. And if they want a degree of supervision on site that is 24/7, that is representing their own views, then they need to appoint somebody to do that for them. Now, I've put this slide in because I am from a building control background, and the most frequent issue we get coming forward is that the client believes that we are a clerk of works. We're there to represent them on site and ensure the building is put together properly. The quote on this slide in terms of what building control don't do, quality control, clerk of works, looking at finishes, looking at contractual arrangements and guaranteeing compliance, that is a direct lift from CIC-AIR's website, and they are the regulating body who appoint private sector building control. So it's acknowledged that at the current framework, these are not the things that building control are actually doing. But within that, you do have to ask yourself, well, what are building control doing then? And they are exercising all reasonable professional skill to ensure that the building does comply. But unfortunately, nobody can be on site all of the time. One of the issues I think the client and the industry need to understand is that if you want to get a good level of inspection, you have to pay for it. I've put together some approximate costs here for a building control process for something like a new dwelling, looking at a few building control providers and looking at the average sort of fee that's charged. And looking at it on this basis with a fairly close site to the office, actually all you're going to be looking at is a relatively few inspections to actually fit within the fee structure. There's very little leeway to cover the cost of the work. It's certainly not like the situation that used to exist 30, 40 years ago, where building control would be on site more or less as and when required, inspecting numerous elements of the building. Now it really is pared back to identifying the risk of non-compliance and inspecting at those areas. The problem with that is that we are seeing from experience an increasing number of areas that are at risk of non-compliance and areas that need to focus the attention of the inspection regime. So what are we going to have to do? Well, everybody, industry, academia, the employers, the professional bodies, the regulators, we're all going to have to address the issue of competence. And to be honest, that in itself is an issue. I've said and explained what my company's doing. Other companies are doing similar sorts of things, but this is something that actually needs a joined up approach across the industry. We're doing it because we have to demonstrate that we're doing it, but we need to make sure that there's a common thread here. We do need to constantly assess and review what we're doing, and we do need to drill into what skills are needed. There is still an element of we're looking at the same skills we've always looked at. When we educate people, we educate to the same standards we've always looked at, even though we've got an industry that is evolved and moved on. We do need to make sure that people are paid correctly for what they're doing, and clearly everybody needs to try and educate the client in this process. In terms of the regulatory approach, I'm not unique in saying that we need to clarify the regulations and the guidance. I do think we need to look at the scope of the regulations and what we're expecting people to be able to deal with, and maybe focus on critical areas. There does need to be a balance between innovation and evolution and the desire for tried and tested solutions. We need a better testing regime that is quicker to respond to change in the industry. And we need to take the theoretical approach and align it with the practical approach and make sure they both work. So at that point, I'll ask if there's any questions.
Brilliant, thank you, Kevin. We do have a question come in, but just as a message to everybody, if you do have any questions that you would like to put to Kevin, now's the opportunity to type those into us and we'll pick them up on our screens. So what's coming from Stuart is it's more of a sort of an open question really, but as somebody who works in the building operations side of the building industry, he's asking for your thoughts on the importance of operation and maintenance manuals post-construction.
Yeah, to be honest, an operations manual, maintenance manual, absolutely critical. The buildings we build today are far more complex than they used to be, packed with an ever-increasing range of technology. And unless that information is put together at the end of the project into an operations manual that can then feed into the people who are actually going to live with the building for its life cycle, it becomes increasingly difficult to understand how we're going to run the building effectively. So, you know, that it goes from the one extreme of maybe in some buildings labeling every door to say what it achieves, down to the detail of what's being provided. I'll give you an example. I was asked to look recently at a project where the client felt that the detection system that had been put in didn't meet the requirements. And it required quite a bit of going along, having a look, taking detectors off ceilings to establish whether they were mains powered, whether they were radio linked, whether they were long life lithium batteries or whatever. All of that sort of stuff would have been handled and the problem resolved had the owner been given details of what he had in his building and how it runs. And once particularly we get to commercial buildings and complex buildings, it needs far more information for the end user. And one of the big issues, I think, is because in the current format, the building regulations are very much like an MOT. On the day of completion, it's fit for purpose. And there's no continuing process. There's a reliance that all the measures we put into the building are going to be properly maintained and kept live and serviced and even replaced as and when necessary. And that's not necessarily appreciated. The particularly domestic clients tend to think what they've got in their building is suitable to last for the lifespan of the building and they don't necessarily have to touch it. And it is absolutely critical that we need this joined up approach following through with information. The amount that's written into legislation that has to be passed on is not enough for somebody who's effectively going to manage a large complex building. But to have an operations manual is fine. When I was at CABE, I used to say 20 years ago, what we wanted passed on to the owner in terms of a manual was the equivalent of the glove box manual for the car. It told you how to turn the lights on, how to adjust the heating. Nowadays, increasingly, what we're passing on is the equivalent of the Haynes manual. It's far more comprehensive and needs a lot more care and attention in the life cycle maintenance of the building, because the building may be absolutely brilliant at day one and fail. And there's almost a need to go one step further, not just explain what the building and its services and its fittings do, but also black and white point out to the end user what they can and cannot do within that building. Because people do take on a building and assume they can use all parts for all things. And that can have major ramifications if you just think about the use of a particular room. If a room's designed as an office and later becomes a meeting room, there are implications on means of escape. And yes, that should be picked up by a fire risk assessment. But other aspects of the building could equally change. People start to use what was a meeting room as a storeroom and putting in high loads of storage, and you can possibly overload parts of the structure. So there is a need for an understanding of what the building was designed to do in the first place. Okay.
Excellent, thank you, Kevin. Graham's kind of highlighting your point that the manual needs to be comprehensive and accurate, but he's also raised the point of perhaps in his experience that it's just the case that the building and the designer just wants to complete the build and then move on, and therefore is the attention paid that needs to be?
Yeah, I think there is an element that it's partly around the contractual arrangements. So a lot of buildings now, actually, the building designer's role tends to finish once they've got the statutory approvals, so planning and building regulations. They'll do some amendments during the construction, but primarily their contractual arrangement has completed. So quite often the operations manual is actually being put together by maybe the contractor, and it is about keeping that buy-in all the way through to get that information there. We do need to look at who's responsible at what stage and how information is passed on. It's very, very clear if you look at CDM regulations in terms of the health and safety stuff as to where that information trail goes and who's responsible. We need the same sort of framework in place for everything else that affects the use and the maintenance of the building.
Thank you. Right, so that's all the comments that have come in so far this morning. So we'll give everybody the last 2 minutes just to send any further comments through. But whilst people are just doing that, just like to bring to your attention our next webinar, which will be on Wednesday the 17th of October. And for that one, we're going to look at low carbon buildings, and we'll be joined by Professor Phil Jones, who's Chair of Architectural Science at the Royal School of Architecture at Cardiff University. So he'll be sharing his expertise with us on that day. Feel free to register via our website, or after this event, you'll get a link to the registration page, so you can just use that to come through. But as yet, there's nothing else coming in. So what I'm going to do at this stage is I'm going to say thank you very much to Kevin for presenting for us this morning, and thank you all for joining us. Again, the usual deal applies. If you've got any questions, comments, feedback, or any subjects you want us to cover, if you want to deliver any webinars for us, feel free, get in touch with me. That would be fantastic. This will be uploaded to my YouTube channel later today. So again, link will come around to you if you need to share it, want to share it with any colleagues, or that may have missed this morning's session, or again, you can just catch up with it online. And it's 1 hour CPD for attending this morning. So thank you all very much for joining us, and we will see you soon.